Commander Paul Speer heard the missile warning before he saw the wall of fire below him. 25 surface-to-air missiles were climbing toward his flight, telephone poles of smoke rising off the rice paddies west of Hanoi. His 6 Crusaders were meant to be the shield that day. 2 small attack jets were somewhere beneath him, lining up on a power plant barely a mile from the center of the enemy capital, and everything above those 2 jets was Speer's responsibility. It was May 19, 1967. It was Ho Chi Minh's birthday, and the North Vietnamese had put nearly every fighter they owned into the air to make certain the Americans paid for choosing that particular morning. Speer was flying the one American fighter that nobody in the Pentagon had really wanted to build. It carried 4 cannon in its nose at a time when the smartest men in Washington had decided that guns on a fighter were a relic, like a sword worn on the bridge of a battleship. It was called the last Gunfighter, and in the next few minutes it was going to prove something that the entire American defense establishment had spent a decade insisting was impossible. Before we go any further, I want to ask a small favor. This is a small Cold War history channel, and honestly the numbers have been rough lately. If you enjoy carefully researched stories like this one, the single most helpful thing you can do is subscribe, leave a comment, and share the video with one person who loves this era. Every click tells the algorithm this kind of history is worth showing to someone new, and it is the only reason I am able to keep making these. That is the whole ask. Now let us get back to the sky over Hanoi. For 2 years, the air war over North Vietnam had been quietly humiliating for the United States. On paper, it should not have been close. The Americans flew supersonic jets that cost more than some small nations earned in a year. Their enemy flew a stubby, subsonic fighter designed in the early 1950s, a machine that on every specification sheet looked hopelessly outdated. And yet, again and again, that little fighter was turning inside the Americans, hammering them with cannon fire and slipping back toward Hanoi before the bigger jets could even bring their weapons to bear. The machine doing the humiliating was the MiG-17. NATO called it the Fresco. It was a refinement of the same basic fighter that had fought American pilots to a bloody standstill over Korea a decade earlier, the MiG-15, and its greatest gift was almost embarrassingly simple. It could turn. In a tight, slow, twisting knife fight, the kind where 2 aircraft chase each other around an ever-shrinking circle in the sky, nothing the Americans flew could stay with it. It weighed very little. Its wings were broad for its size. It could haul itself around a corner in the air, so tightly that heavier jets simply slid past, overshooting, suddenly finding that the hunter had become the hunted. One of the most respected fighter pilots in the United States Air Force, a man who had shot down German aircraft over Europe and would later become an ace all over again in Vietnam, described the little MiG in tones close to awe. He warned that it could give a pilot the fight of his life, that it turned on a dime, and that its turn radius simply had to be seen to be believed. This was not a man given to fear. He was giving a plain, professional assessment of a machine that could outfly almost anything the West sent against it, as long as the fight stayed slow and close. And the MiG-17 carried a punch that matched its agility. In its nose sat one 37mm cannon and two 23mm cannon. These were not fast-firing weapons. They spat out shells slowly, heavily, with a brutal recoil that shook the whole airframe. But a single 37mm round could tear the wing off an American fighter, and a pilot patient enough to wait for the right moment did not need many of them. The men flying these fighters were not the amateurs some in Washington had assumed they would be. They were guided from the ground by radar controllers who could see the whole battle unfolding, vectored into position from below and behind, told exactly when to strike and exactly when to run. They studied old dogfights from earlier wars, hunting for any edge. One of their sayings summed up the entire philosophy. Whoever fires first wins. They rarely tried to climb and chase the faster American jets, a game they could not win. Instead, they lurked low, near the ground, where the clutter on American radar screens hid them, and they waited for the heavy fighter bombers lumbering in toward their targets loaded with ordnance. Then they slashed up from below, fired, and dived away before the escorts could react. It was the tactic of a lighter, weaker opponent who has learned to pick his moment, and against aircraft chained to a bombing run, it worked far better than it had any right to. The most dangerous of them became a legend in his own country, and his life is worth pausing on, because he was the human face of that little machine. His name was Nguyen Van Bay. He was a farmer's son from the Mekong Delta, the seventh child of his family, and he liked to point out that the number 7 had followed him everywhere. He joined the army young, learned to fly on a compressed schedule that would have terrified a Western training command, and went on to be credited by his own Air Force with 7 aircraft shot down, every one of them scored in the MiG-17. He was named a hero of the Vietnamese People's Armed Forces on the first day of 1967. He was never shot down himself, though he once brought a MiG home so full of holes that the ground crew could scarcely believe it had flown. He advised younger pilots to fly the way a farmer drives a plow behind a buffalo, aim straight at the enemy, and simply fight. He survived the war, returned to the Delta, and lived out his years growing fruit and raising fish until a stroke took him in 2019 at the age of 83. He was proof that in the right hands, this obsolete little machine was one of the most dangerous objects in the sky. To understand why the Americans had no good answer to it, you have to understand a decision made years before the war, in air-conditioned offices, thousands of miles from any battlefield. Sometime in the late 1950s, the brightest strategic minds in the United States had reached a conclusion that felt, at the time, like simple common sense. The dogfight was dead. The age of 2 pilots twisting around each other trying to line up a gun was over. A piece of romantic history belonging to the era of silk scarves and open cockpits. The future was the guided missile. A modern fighter would detect its enemy on radar from many miles away, launch a missile, and turn for home long before the 2 aircraft ever came close enough to see one another. In that future, a gun was just dead weight. Hard maneuvering was pointless. Why teach a pilot to wrench his aircraft around until he nearly blacks out, when he would never need to? This belief ran so deep that it shaped the most important American aircraft of the era. The F-4 Phantom, the big, powerful, twin-engine jet that would carry the weight of the air war, was designed with no gun at all. None. It was built as a flying missile platform, an interceptor meant to knock down slow enemy bombers at long range with radar-guided weapons. The men who designed it were not fools. Within the logic of the doctrine they had been handed, leaving out the gun was the rational choice. The gun belonged to the past. The missile was the future. As one American aviation historian put it later, there had been a strange idea inside the Defense Department that the gun was finished, and the gun, he said, had never been finished at all. There was only one aircraft in the American arsenal over North Vietnam that had been born of an older, more stubborn idea. That aircraft was the F-8 Crusader. The Crusader had been designed in the mid-1950s as a pure fighter, a machine whose entire reason for existing was to win the fight against another fighter. It was fast, it was sleek, and it broke records almost as a matter of habit. One young Marine pilot named John Glenn flew a photographic version of it clear across the United States, faster than the speed of sound in 1957, the first supersonic transcontinental flight in history, before he ever became famous for anything else. But the detail that mattered most in combat was in the nose. The Crusader carried 4 20mm cannon because the men who drew it up still believed, quietly and unfashionably, that a fighter pilot might one day need to shoot another aircraft out of the sky at close range. When the missile age swept through American thinking, the Crusader was already the odd one out, the last of a breed. Its pilots knew it and wore it like a badge. They were fighter pilots in the oldest sense, and they flew the one Navy jet built from the start to dogfight. That is how it earned its nickname, the last of the gunfighters. Here is where the story turns, and where it becomes stranger than the myth around it. Because the weapon the Crusader would use to dominate the MiG-17 was not, in the end, its guns. When the fighting started in earnest, the Americans discovered 2 brutal facts almost at once. The first was that their beautiful missile-age doctrine did not survive contact with reality. The rules of engagement over Vietnam usually forced American pilots to visually identify a target before firing, to be certain they were not shooting down one of their own aircraft in the crowded sky. That single rule erased the entire advantage of the long-range missile. You could not fire at an anonymous dot on a radar screen 40 miles away if you were required to fly close enough to see it with your own eyes first. And once you were that close, you were in exactly the kind of short-range turning fight the doctrine had promised would never happen again. The second brutal fact was that the missiles themselves did not work the way the brochures had promised. The radar-guided missile carried by the Phantom, the Sparrow, was fired more than 600 times during the air war and brought down its target only about 9 times in every 100 shots. The heat-seeking missile, the Sidewinder, did better, but across the war, it still worked only about 1 time in 5, and worse than that in its earliest versions. Before the war, testing had suggested these weapons would hit something like 2 out of every 3 shots. The gap between the test range and the real war was staggering. On the test range, the missiles were fired inside careful limits, against targets flying straight and level, in clean, dry air, by crews who knew exactly what to expect. Over Hanoi, they were yanked off the rails in high-speed turns, in soaking tropical humidity, against enemies hurling their aircraft violently around the sky, and they missed and missed and missed. The radar missile in particular demanded that the pilot hold his enemy dead ahead and keep his own radar locked on all the way to impact, a nearly impossible thing to do while an alarmed MiG twisted and rolled to shake him off. Salt air corroded delicate electronics. Vibration loosened connections. Missiles left the aircraft and simply flew off stupidly into empty sky, or refused to leave at all. Pilots came home again and again with the same furious report that they had done everything right, held the enemy squarely in their sights, fired, and watched their expensive weapon do nothing whatsoever. So the American pilot found himself trapped between 2 failures. The doctrine had told him he would never dogfight, so his aircraft and often his training were built around the missile. But the rules of engagement forced him into the dogfight anyway, and the missiles betrayed him the moment he got there. Nowhere was this trap more cruel than in the Phantom, that powerful gunless jet, whose crews sometimes found themselves locked in a close-turning fight with a nimble MiG-17 and simply no weapon that would function. One Phantom pilot later called the missing gun the single biggest mistake of the entire aircraft. Bullets, he said, were cheap and tended to go exactly where you aimed them, and he had wished desperately for a gun he did not have. The Crusader lived in the same trap, but it had one thing the others lacked. It could fight. It could turn hard enough, and its pilots were trained aggressively enough, that when a MiG-17 tried to drag a Crusader down into a knife fight, the Crusader could often stay with it and win. And here is the irony at the very center of this story. When the Crusader won, it usually won with the Sidewinder, the very heat-seeking missile that failed so often for everyone else. The difference was not the weapon, the difference was the man carrying it, and the aircraft he flew. A Crusader pilot could outfly a MiG into the narrow slice of sky where even an unreliable missile would work, tucked in close behind the enemy, lined up on the hot exhaust, near enough that the shot could hardly miss. The last Gunfighter did most of its killing with a missile, but it could only do that because it was flown like a gunfighter's aircraft, pressed in tight, nose to tail, in exactly the way the doctrine had sworn no one would ever fight again. The guns themselves carried a bitter secret, and it explains a great deal. The 4 cannon in the Crusader's nose were prone to jamming at the worst possible moment. Under the heavy load of a hard turn, when the aircraft was straining through the very maneuvers a dogfight demanded, the ammunition feed could snarl and the guns could fall silent. A pilot would line up the shot of his life, squeeze the trigger, and get nothing. The weapon that gave the aircraft its proud nickname was the weapon least likely to be there when he needed it. Fleet reports judged the gun system unsatisfactory in sustained combat. So the men who flew the last Gunfighter learned to treat the cannon as a companion to the missile rather than a replacement for it, a way to rattle an enemy or finish a cripple, while the Sidewinder did the real work. The first proof came on June 12, 1966. A veteran Crusader pilot named Harold Marr, commanding a squadron off the carrier Hancock, found himself in the middle of a swarm of MiG-17s. He fired a Sidewinder, and it missed. He fired a second, and in his own blunt words, it zapped the enemy fighter clean. The MiG blew apart so low to the ground that the fight had been playing out barely 50 feet above the earth, the two sides close enough, as Marr described it, to be looking at each other eyeball to eyeball. He then chewed at a second MiG with his cannon until he ran out of ammunition and had to turn for home. It was the Crusaders' first kill of the war, and it set the pattern for almost everything that followed. Guns tried, guns frustrated, and then the missile finishing the job once the pilot had flown himself into the perfect position. There was one man whose story captured the spirit of the Crusader community better than any statistic, and he deserves to be more than a name in a list. His name was Richard Bellinger. He had learned to fly during the Second World War, instructing young men on twin-engine bombers before the fighting ended, and he had flown in Korea as well. By the time he reached Vietnam, he was already past 40, ancient by the standards of a fighter cockpit, a loud, hard-living, hard-headed man his fellow pilots remembered as a kind of raging bull. He fought the way he lived, with more aggression than caution, and the younger pilots in his squadron half feared and half worshipped him for it. In July of 1966, Bellinger tangled with a MiG over the north, took damage, ran his fuel down to nothing trying to limp back towards safety, and finally had to eject far out over the water, where a helicopter fished him from the sea after his aircraft failed him. For a proud man, it was a humiliation, and Bellinger did not swallow humiliation quietly. 3 months later, on October 9, 1966, he got his answer. Flying his Crusader off the carrier Oriskany, Bellinger shot down a MiG-21, the newer, faster, genuinely modern enemy fighter that had begun to appear alongside the older MiG-17s. He put it into a rice paddy. It was the first time a United States Navy pilot had ever downed one of these advanced jets, and the Secretary of Defense himself pinned a silver star on Bellinger's chest aboard the carrier soon after. The man who had been pulled out of the ocean in disgrace had come back and killed the best fighter his enemy owned. But the story does not end in triumph, and I am not going to pretend that it does. Only weeks after that victory, a catastrophic fire tore through the Oriskany, killing 44 men. Bellinger, whose quarters lay dangerously close to where the blaze began, survived by clawing an air conditioning unit out of the wall and forcing his heavy frame through the small porthole behind it, emerging onto the deck with nothing but his life. And in the decades after the war, this larger-than-life fighter pilot slipped quietly into the fog of Alzheimer's disease and died in a veterans facility, his fire finally gone out. A squadron mate remembered him simply as a man who was always there to do the job, and who did it well. All of this, the doctrine, the trap, the frustrated guns and the redeeming missile, came to a head on that morning over Hanoi on May 19, 1967, Ho Chi Minh's birthday. It was the first time the American Navy struck a target in the very heart of downtown Hanoi, a thermal power plant barely a mile from the city center, and the carrier that launched the raid was proud to record that no naval force had ever hit that target before. It was such a costly day across the whole fleet that the men who flew it would remember it by a grim name: Black Friday. 3 carriers each lost 2 aircraft over the north before the sun went down, 6 jets and 10 airmen gone in a single day. The sky was thick with anti-aircraft fire and those climbing telephone poles of surface-to-air missiles. Into that sky went a small strike package. 2 attack jets carried the actual bombs meant for the power plant. Around them flew 12 Crusaders, half of them tasked with beating down the guns and missiles on the ground, and half of them, Paul Spear's flight, tasked with keeping the MiGs off everyone else. As the Americans finished their run and turned for the coast, the MiG-17s came at them just west of the city. What happened next lasted only minutes, and it was exactly the fight the doctrine had promised would never occur. Spear, still dodging that barrage of surface-to-air missiles, spotted a MiG closing dangerously on the vulnerable attack jets. He turned hard into it, worked himself into position, and fired 2 sidewinders. The MiG dived into the ground and exploded. His wingman, a young officer named Joseph Shea, fought his own MiG, hammering at it with cannon fire to force it into a corner and then finishing it with a sidewinder, the guns and the missile working exactly together in the way the Crusader fought best. In the same swirling battle, 2 more Crusader pilots, Bobby Lee and Philip Wood, each brought down a MiG-17. Wood was actually struck by enemy cannon fire in the middle of the fight, reversed hard on the aircraft that had hit him, shot it down anyway, and then nursed his damaged jet away to land on a different carrier entirely. For leading his flight through that storm and destroying an enemy fighter bearing down on the men he was protecting, Spear would receive the Navy Cross, one of the highest awards his country could give. 4 MiGs destroyed by Crusaders in a single engagement. But that day carried its full price too, and honesty demands that we count it. One of the Crusader pilots in the escort, a man named K. Russell, was hit by a surface-to-air missile, his aircraft set ablaze, and he was forced to eject right beside Hanoi. He was captured almost at once and spent nearly 6 years as a prisoner of war before his release in the spring of 1973. Another pilot from the strike, William Metzger, was hit by anti-aircraft fire, wounded, and also captured, held for more than 2,000 days before he too came home in that same spring. 4 victories in the air and 2 men vanishing into years of captivity below. That was the true arithmetic of Black Friday, and the Crusaders' finest single day sat right in the middle of it. 2 months later came the moment the last gunfighter had, in a sense, been waiting for all along. On July 21, 1967, a Crusader pilot named Robert Kirkwood, flying off the carrier Bonhomme Richard, caught a MiG-17 and did the thing the whole legend was named after. He shot it down with his cannon alone. No missile, just guns. He closed to around 300 feet, near enough that he could watch his shells striking the enemy fuselage, watch the thin metal skin seem to dissolve under the impacts, watch a bright white fire begin to fill the machine from the inside. It was a pure gun kill, the kind the doctrine had declared extinct. And it turned out to be the last of its kind. Kirkwood's victory that day is recognized as the last time in the history of United States naval aviation that a pilot shot down another aircraft using guns alone. The last gunfighter had fired the last gun kill. Everything after would belong to the missile. That same day, 2 other Crusader pilots scored, and their kills quietly made the point all over again. Marion Isaacs, whose own aircraft had caught fire during the fight, refused to break off and reversed straight back into the battle, downing his MiG with a sidewinder. Ray Hubbard brought his down with an odd, improvised combination of cannon fire and unguided rockets, the sort of weapon meant for hitting targets on the ground. Guns, missiles, rockets, all of it, in the hands of men who insisted on turning and fighting rather than running. The doctrine said the era of the dogfight was finished. The men flying the Crusader kept proving, 1 kill at a time, that it had never actually ended. By the time the last confirmed Crusader victory was scored, on September 19, 1968, the pattern was complete. A pilot named Anthony Nagy, flying off the carrier Intrepid with his wingman close beside him, worked the pair of them into position behind a MiG-21 that was throwing itself around the sky trying to escape. The 2 Crusaders used a loose, flexible teamwork the fighter school would soon be preaching to the whole Navy, one aircraft pressing the attack while the other watched his back and waited for its own chance. Nagy fired a sidewinder and blew the tail section clean off the enemy jet. Its pilot ejected beneath an orange parachute. It was the F-8's 18th and final confirmed kill of the war, and it closed the ledger on the Crusaders' fight against the MiGs. The aircraft Nagy flew that day was eventually preserved in a museum, painted once more in the markings it wore on the morning it made history. That number is worth stating plainly and carefully, because it sits at the beating heart of this whole story. The United States Navy officially credited the F-8 Crusader with 18 MiG kills. Most histories round the figure up to 19, depending on which claims you count as fully confirmed, and the split between the older MiG-17s and the newer MiG-21s varies a little from one source to another. Against those victories, only 3 Crusaders were lost in air-to-air combat, all 3 of them in 1966, all 3 to the cannon of the MiG-17. That works out to a kill ratio of roughly 6-1. It was the best of any American fighter in the entire war. The powerful, celebrated Phantom, flying far more missions and meeting far more MiGs, finished the war at a little over 5-1. But I want to be honest about that number rather than let it swell into a myth, because the truth is more interesting than the legend. The Crusader flew in far fewer fighter squadrons than the Phantom, so it simply met the enemy in the air less often, and a smaller number of fights makes a clean ratio easier to achieve. The North Vietnamese, for their part, claim to have shot down many more Crusaders than the Americans ever admitted, and the 2 sides' record books have never agreed, and probably never will. And the Crusader was, in plain truth, a dangerous aircraft to fly even when there was no enemy anywhere near it. It was punishing to bring back aboard a carrier deck, so punishing that the men who flew it gave it a dark nickname, the Ensign Eliminator, for the way it ended the careers, and sometimes the lives, of young pilots still learning its temper. One admiral who flew it noted that of the many Crusaders the Navy bought, very nearly every single one was involved in a major accident at some point in its life. Far more of them were lost to those accidents, and to ground fire and surface-to-air missiles, than were ever lost to enemy fighters. The Crusader was not a magic sword. It was a hard, demanding, sometimes lethal machine that happened to be flown by some of the most aggressive fighter pilots the Navy had, at the one job it was born to do. The men in Washington could not ignore what the numbers were telling them, though it took a crisis to make them finally listen. Across the middle years of the war, the Navy's overall success rate in air combat had sagged alarmingly. For every enemy fighter its pilots shot down, they were losing their own at a rate that had collapsed to somewhere around 2-to-1 at its worst. That was a shadow of the lopsided results American airmen had achieved in the Second World War and in Korea, and it was a shocking figure for a force flying the most expensive and advanced machines on Earth. Someone had to explain how supposedly obsolete little MiGs were trading so nearly even with the finest aircraft American industry could build. The Navy handed that question to a veteran officer named Frank Ault and told him to find the answer. Ault dug into everything: the missiles, the training, the tactics, the rules, the maintenance in the humid hangars of the fleet. His report landed on the first day of 1969, and it was devastating in its clarity. He found hundreds of separate problems. The missiles were unreliable, the maintenance was uneven, but the deepest problem was the one the doctrine had created years earlier. American pilots had been trained to push a button and fire a missile from far away. They had never truly been taught to dogfight, because their leaders had decided that the dogfight was dead. And so when the dogfight refused to stay buried, when it came roaring back over Hanoi exactly as it always had, the pilots were caught unready for it. Ault's most important recommendation was simple: build a school. Teach fighter pilots to fight again, the real way, up close, against an enemy who flew differently than they did, and force them to think. And so, on March 3, 1969, in a borrowed trailer at an air station in California, with almost no money and a small handful of the best fighter instructors the Navy could find, the United States Navy Fighter Weapons School opened its doors. The pilots gave it a shorter name that the whole world would eventually come to know. They called it Top Gun. Here the Crusaders' role becomes quietly essential, in a way the movies never mention. The community that trained Crusader pilots had already been doing this hard, honest work of learning to dogfight. Veterans flew older aircraft in the role of enemy MiGs, teaching younger pilots what it felt like to fight something small and nimble that would not simply cooperate, and they passed what they learned to the new school. The last of the gunfighters did not only win its own battles, it helped carry the half-forgotten art of close air combat forward into the school that would rebuild it for a whole generation of American pilots. The results were dramatic. Within a few years, the Navy's kill ratio had climbed enormously, and by the intense air battles of 1972, its trained pilots were dominating the very skies where the war had once gone so badly for them. The old aircraft themselves faded out with dignity. The Navy retired its last Crusader fighter squadrons in 1976, replacing them with a new generation of swing-wing fighters. But the unarmed photographic version of the Crusader, the one John Glenn had flown across the country, lived a longer and in some ways more important life. It was an aircraft of that type that flew low and fast over Cuba during the missile crisis of 1962, streaking across the island at rooftop height, to bring back the photographs that proved Soviet nuclear missiles were being installed there. Those pictures, taken by unarmed Crusaders on a mission code named for the moon, were among the hard evidence laid before a stunned world. And in an irony that would have delighted the men who flew it, the very last Crusaders flying anywhere on the planet were not American at all. They belonged to the French Navy, which kept its Crusaders launching from its carriers until the last months of 1999. The aircraft the missile age was built to make obsolete outlived most of the missiles that were supposed to replace it. The pilots scattered into the rest of their lives, as pilots do. Some rose to command fleets and retired as admirals. John Glenn, the Marine who had raced the Crusader across the continent faster than sound, went on to ride a rocket into orbit as one of the first Americans in space, and later served for decades in the United States Senate. James Stockdale, a naval aviator who had flown the Crusader and led its pilots during the murky Gulf of Tonkin episode that helped pull America deeper into the war, was shot down in 1965 and endured more than 7 years as a prisoner. He was tortured, and at one point he beat and cut his own face so that his captors could not parade him for propaganda, and he leaned on the words of an ancient Greek philosopher to survive. He came home to receive his nation's highest military honor. And Richard Bellinger, the raging bull who had been fished out of the sea and come back to kill a MiG-21, faded slowly in that veterans' hospital, far from any cockpit. When a historian once asked a Crusader pilot to explain how a plane everyone had called outdated had done so well, the answer came back plain and unbothered. They simply had the better aircraft for the fight they were actually in, and they were willing to have that fight. That was all. That willingness is the real lesson, and it did not stay locked in the 1960s. The argument the Crusader lived through, the argument over whether the dogfight is dead and the gun is a relic, never truly ended. It only went quiet for a while and then came back wearing newer clothes. Today, the most advanced fighters in the world are built once again around the promise that they will see the enemy first, strike from far away, and never need to turn and fight up close. Stealth has replaced the hard turn as the great hope. The finest American fighter of this generation, the F-35, comes in 3 versions, and 2 of the 3 do not carry a built-in gun at all, relying instead on a pod that can be bolted on beneath the aircraft when it is needed. The next generation of fighters now taking shape on the drawing board may carry no internal gun whatsoever, trusting entirely to missiles and to new weapons not yet in service. Perhaps this time the planners are right. The technology is real, and it is extraordinary, far beyond anything the men over Hanoi could have imagined. But those men would recognize the argument instantly because they heard the very same confidence half a century ago, and they watched it collide with a small, stubborn fighter and a set of rules that dragged them into close combat they had been promised would never happen again. The enemy and the circumstances, not the sales brochure, decide how a fight is actually fought. That was the hard lesson of the last Gunfighter. It is the reason nearly every fighter still carries a gun today, tucked away as a last resort, in quiet defiance of every prediction that it would never again be needed. Which brings us back to Paul Speer, twisting through that forest of surface-to-air missiles over Hanoi on Ho Chi Minh's birthday, flying the one aircraft nobody in Washington had really wanted, carrying guns the experts had called obsolete, and winning with a missile that was failing almost everyone else who fired it. The doctrine said his kind of fight was a thing of the past. In the space of a few minutes, he and 3 other men in the same unwanted aircraft proved that it was not. They did it with the last Gunfighter, an airplane built by people stubborn enough to believe that a fighter pilot might still, one day, have to fight. History has a way of rewarding that kind of stubbornness, and the sky over Hanoi, for one violent morning in the spring of 1967, belonged entirely to the aircraft the future was supposed to have left behind.